My name is Ben Ueda, and I'm the director of Homemade Modern, where we publish DIY instructionals for how to build your own furniture. Not only do I get to make things that fit my particular lifestyle, I can control what ingredients and materials I'm using. So if I care about the environment, I can pick sustainably harvested wood. I'm going to show you how to make this table. This is sort of my take on a modern farmhouse table. This is a pretty easy table. It costs less than $100. It's super heavy duty. You can get really creative with this project. You could use it as a desk, you can use it as a dining table, you can make it a little bit shorter, a little bit bigger, and it's a project you can make in a day that'll pretty much last forever. GHTV, genius ideas made easy. So today I'm going to show you how to make this table. This is sort of my take on a modern farmhouse table. And you really don't need that much to do this. You're going to make all your cuts with a circular saw. It has a rotational blade, it has a guide on it. Fairly easy to use, but you can make it easier by using a speed square and a clamp. Now the speed square and the clamp are really going to help you make straighter cuts. Once you've cut all your pieces, you're going to sand them with this orbital sander. Now this is going to save you a ton of time. We're going to start with 80 grit pads and then finish with 220. When they say 80 grit, they mean that it has 80 grains of sand per square inch. That means it's pretty rough and it's going to sand really fast, but you're not going to get the smoothest finish. After you do the 80 grit, you want to switch to 220. That means it has 220 grains of sand per square inch, and that's going to give you a smooth finish that takes stain really nicely. Once your pieces are all sanded, you're ready to assemble. We're going to use a cordless drill. Now this is the tool everybody should have. You can use this for all sorts of things. Not only can you drill holes, you can assemble furniture with it as well. You can even make assembling IKEA furniture faster. Now for the screws themselves, we're going to use both 2.5-inch screws and 3-inch screws. And you can really use any sort of deck screw. So these three power tools are really the only things you need to make this table. And you can make all sorts of other pieces of furniture with them as well. So let's go get some lumber. So we're going to make this table from 2x12s and 2x8s. So we need 4 2x12s. Now these are going to come 12 feet long. Obviously this isn't 12 feet long, but it's easier to move. A 2x12 isn't actually 2 inches by 12 inches. It's actually 1.5 inches by 11.25. We're going to need 2 2x8s. These are actually 1.5 inches by 7.25 inches. Lumber prices will vary, but you can make this table for less than $100.
I love this color. It's looking great.
So this is a 2x12. I use these for a lot of my projects. They're fairly inexpensive, but you have to check them for defects. So typically this is used for rough construction. So finish quality isn't a high priority. So I look for things like this where it's kind of chipped out a little bit, and it's not the end of the world. We can kind of sand over it, but it'll just take a little bit of extra time. So anytime I'm cutting rough construction lumber on a floor, I got to block it up a little bit so that the saw blade doesn't hit the floor. Our first cut is going to be for a side panel, and it's going to be 28 inches in length. So I'm going to measure out 28 inches, mark it, and cut it. And I like to use a speed square so that I have a line to follow when I cut it. I'm going to check the height of my saw blade to make sure that I'm cutting all the way through, and also to make sure that I'm not hitting the floor. I've done this a few times, so I'm somewhat used to it. But if you're doing it for the first time, it might be helpful to clamp the speed square directly to the board so that you have a straight edge to follow. right, so for this next piece, I'm going to cut a piece to be used for the top. And you can make the table as long as you want, well, within reason. But I'm going to make it about 6 feet today. So let's measure off 6 feet. Now the reason I flipped the board is because I want the broad part of the saw stop to rest on the bigger piece of the wood. So even though we measured the pieces, it's always good to make sure that your measurements are relatively accurate. And what I mean by that is within about 1/8 of an inch. Okay, and now I have all the pieces cut for the top and the sides. So now I'm going to switch to 2x8s and cut some supports. I'm going to cut the supports out of 2x8s. And these pieces are not going to be as long as the other ones because I have to account for the thickness of the boards. So the supports that are going to go underneath the top of the table are going to be 3 inches less than the 6 feet for the top pieces. So I'll measure out 5'9". And I'm going to check these support pieces against the top pieces, because I want about 1.5 inches of space between each side, because that is going to allow us to put our side pieces in. Close enough? So I'm going to measure off 5'9". Use my speed square to draw a straight line. Line up the saw blade. And clamp down the square. And it never hurts to check the last piece you cut against the piece you cut before it. Yeah. I'm going to measure in 26.5 inches. now I'm going to cut the last support piece for the table out of another 12-foot long 2x4 or 2x12. So when I pick out construction lumber, 2x12s, 2x4s, 2x6s, etc., I always try to find pieces that are as straight as possible, that don't have major chunks taken out of them. And before I start cutting them, I always make sure to pull out any staples or nails that may be stuck in them. You really don't want to hit a piece of metal when you're cutting through a piece of wood. And this one's a little bit cracked, but it doesn't look like the crack goes all the way through, so we should be okay. We just might have to do a little bit of extra sanding to clean it up. So this piece is going to be 5'9". And since 2x12s, 2x4s, 2x8s, and all those things are 1.5 inch thick, that's where that extra 3 inches is coming from. And that finishes up all the cutting for this project. So now that we have all the pieces cut, we got to do a little bit of sanding. Now you could do this by hand, but you'd be here a while. So we're going to use an orbital sander, which will speed things up. So this is a pretty easy to use tool. You just take these sanding pads. They have sort of a Velcro type surface on the back, and they just stick right to it. So we're going to start with 80 grit and then finish with 220. So what those numbers mean is how many grains of sands per square inch on the sandpaper. So if it's 80 grit, that means there's only 80 little pieces of grit per square inch. So the lower the number, the rougher the sandpaper, and the faster it's going to sand down the wood. So we're going to sand these pieces, both sides and the edges as well. Now you don't really have to push hard on the sander. You just hold the machine and move it around in a nice pattern and let the weight of the machine do the work. Flip the boards over and do the other side. So the edge right here is a little bit chipped. And so when I'm sanding it, it's just vibrating these pieces around. So I'm just going to go ahead and break off these pieces and use a knife to sort of clean it up a little bit. So every so often, check your sanding pad. After time, you'll knock off some of the sand and it'll get a little bit smoother. So you always can just switch out to a fresh one. So these sanding pads will have holes on them, and that's so that the sawdust that you're sanding can actually go through and be collected in the dust bag. So you want to try to do your best to make sure those holes line up. And periodically check the bag to make sure it's not full. Otherwise, you'll be breathing a lot more dust. I like the ends of the pieces to be a little bit rounded over. And you can do that either with a knife, where you cut away from yourself and just carve them down a little bit, or you can just do it with the sander. And always try to cut away from yourself. So I found a staple in this board, and I probably should have done a little bit more of a thorough check of them before I started cutting and working on them, but I'm just going to pop it right out. And again, when you're working with construction grade lumber, you always want to check and make sure there's no nails, staples, or little pieces of wire stuck in the wood. And we're done with sanding. So sanding is by far, for this project at least, the longest step, but it's definitely worth it. It's what lets you transform rough construction lumber into a finished product. Now that we're done with sanding, our next step is to start assembling the table. So now that all the pieces are cut and sanded, I'm going to lay them out and just double check my measurements so everything comes together as it should. I'm also going to pick which faces look the best. So I think this is what my top is going to look like, but let me just double check. Yeah, that's the ugly side. So I'm going to start putting the supports together, which means if this is the top, I'm going to assemble the supports from the bottom, so I'm going to flip it over. And grab my supports boards. So these are the 2x8s. And I want to screw one of them to this center 2x12 support. It's going to go right about here on the underside of the table. But it's kind of difficult to screw through on the side, so I want to set it up so I can screw down vertically. So I'll use one of my 2x8s as a support so that I can rest the 2x12 on top of them both. And I'm going to screw it together with 3-inch deck screws and my cordless drill. So line up the ends. Hold the screw in place. Sometimes the screw, when you screw through, will push up the boards. So if that happens, back it up a little bit. Apply a little more pressure. And then screw it back down. So rather than work my way down, I'm going to put one here, which will hold it in place, and then make sure this is pivoted so that it's nicely lined up, and then do this end. There we go. Now I can add more screws in the middle for strength. Don't really need to wear safety glasses for this, but should anyways. So we'll do a screw about every foot. Now, some woodworkers like to glue the wood together as well, which gives it added strength. I don't really like to do that because I like to have the flexibility. People move a lot, and it's always nice if you can take your furniture apart and build something else out of it. Once you go with glue, you're kind of permanent, and you're stuck with what you got. There we go. So now we have our middle support. Should go nicely there. So next step will be to line up all the ends of the tabletop. And then in the center one, we want to find the center of it. And mark it. And let's do that on both sides. So we don't want to screw the supports all the way to the edge of the tabletop. We want to leave 1.5 inches of space so we have room for the sideboards to come in. So we're going to measure 1.5 inches in from the edges. Okay. Good. And if you want to extend those lines, a speed square is a good tool for doing it. So I'm going to screw the support to the middle board first. So I'm going to line it up to my pencil marks. Hold it down firmly and screw through from the bottom. So I screw through from the bottom so that the screw heads won't show on the top of the table. And once again, I put one screw in one side first, move all the way down to the other end, double check to make sure everything's aligned, and then put in the second screw. And then again, I can add a screw every foot. So I'm now going to push in the second tabletop board. Make sure it's aligned with the center one. And then screw through the support board and into the second tabletop board. Now ready to connect the final tabletop board. So this is actually a pretty simple project to put together, and it's a good one for beginners. All you're really doing is cutting the wood, sanding it, and then fastening it together by driving a few screws. So even though it looks big and it's a little bit cumbersome and the sanding takes a little bit of time, it's actually not that difficult. So now that I got the centerpiece all assembled, I'm ready to do the side panels. So I just want to make sure everything's lined up. So I'm going to slide it over, line up each board. And start assembling these panels. Now, I'd already laid this out with the nice side up, which means we want this to be on the outside, which also means we want the supports on the other side. So let's flip it over. And now that I have them lined up, I'm going to transfer that mark. So now that the boards are lined up, I'm going to mark again at 5.5 inches, which is right in line with the other mark, and go to the other end, do the same thing, and again mark at 5.5 inches. Because that is where the support board is going to be. Nice. All right. Now I want the support board to be flush with the end of the side panel boards, because this is going to be the bottom of the table that supports everything. And once I have the board lined up, I'll apply a little pressure and drive a screw through it. And just keep adding screws about every 8 inches will be good enough. So I want a gap in between the support boards so that this center support will slide right into there. So I'm going to line this up just temporarily right here take my pencil and draw a line on the other side that tells me where to screw this board into. Let's just test to make sure it fits. Perfect. So now we'll assemble the other side panel. I'll line up the ends of the boards. Measure in 5.5 inches. And line up the support boards. So I need to leave a gap in between the two support boards. And that gap is going to be the width of the 2x12 for the center support. So I'm going to put this support board right in place and then draw a line. And then use this line so that I know where to screw this board to the side panels. And so now we have the second side panel assembled. And let's again check the fit. Perfect. So now that the panels are all assembled, we're ready to put the table together. So Isha here is going to help me out. It's always helpful to have an extra set of hands when you're moving around heavy objects. So let's lift this up. Slide it into place. And good. Now, to assemble it, we're going to start with an L bracket. This is a little piece of metal that'll hold it into place before we can put screws through the side of the panel and into the center support. So I'm just going to place this right here. Take some 2.5-inch screws. Screw that in. And if you'll just hold it firmly right there, because I'm going to screw through it. There we go. So that loosely holds it into place. And we can drive a couple extra screws just to strengthen it up. And these L brackets are great. They're kind of like Band-Aids. If you don't quite get your joints that strong, you can always add bigger L brackets to add strength to whatever you're building. All right, so now we're able to screw through this side. And I think it'll hold now. Yep, look at that. Thank you, Isha. So the L bracket loosely holds it into place, which is great because now it'll be stable while we put in 3-inch screws through the side panel and into the center support. Now it's pretty stable right now, but we could always add more L brackets if you want it to be stronger. All right, and now we're just going to tilt up the other panel. Lift it into place. Just hold it firm right there. And screw in the other L bracket. Okay, now I'm going to push this screw in, so you're going to have to hold it on this side. Yeah, there you go. Great. And it should hold now. Thank you, Isha. So now we have the L bracket in to hold this up somewhat loosely. We're going to screw through this panel with 3-inch screws into the center support. Now the tricky part is, where is the center support? Well, we still have our mark on the edge of it that shows us where the center of the board is. And so we just want to measure 3/4 of an inch over from that. And then draw marks for our screws. About every 1.5 inches. Then take 3-inch screws. And drive them through. There we go. So nobody likes a wobbly table, so we're going to check for parts of this side panel that are a little bit higher than the other, and then grind them down with the orbital sander. So now that the table's all ground down, we're ready to flip it over. And it's pretty heavy, so I'm going to take a little help from Isha. Watch your fingers. Great. Yeah. Now we scuffed up the top a little bit by sliding around on the floor, but a little more sanding and we'll be ready to finish it. So again, this is a pretty easy table. It costs less than $100. You can do it in about half a day. Thank you, Isha.
That's great.
And now we're ready to stain it and finish it in whatever way you want. So we worked really hard to build this table. So before we apply a stain or a finish, we want to test them out to make sure they are what we want them to be. So I got a sample that's from one of the same pieces of wood that we used to build the table. And we're going to test these different stains and finishes out. So right here I have some stains, right? So I have an ebony, a gray, and a Danish oil. Danish oil is probably one of the finishes I use the most. It's basically linseed oil, and it'll just bring out the natural colors of the wood. These Minwax stains will change the color of the wood. I have one in gray and one in ebony, and they can give you a little bit more of a modern look by sort of suppressing some of the color in the wood. I also have protective finishes. I have an acrylic finish and a mineral oil one. The mineral oil one is pretty good if you are worried about your kids occasionally gnawing on the edge of the table. This is a non-toxic food-grade mineral oil finish. It's often used for butcher blocks and cutting boards. Now this is a polyacrylic finish. It's going to give the wood a slightly plasticized feel, which is why I tend not to use these. But if you're really worried about your kids coloring on the table with crayons, this might be what you want. In general, I don't like to use too much of the protective finishes. I figure if you're going to build a solid wood table, let it get distressed the way solid wood does. But you can apply these in various different amounts of coats to protect it as you want. All right, so let's get started with staining it. So first we're going to try the Minwax ebony stain. So we'll just take a little bit with a foam brush and brush it on the scrap piece of wood. Now you can apply these stains in coats to create a thicker finish. Now what's great about these stains is that they'll change the color of the wood, but still let you see the wood grain, whereas a paint will cover both. Okay, and now let's try the gray. Now for these stains, I'll just use a cheap foam brush. If I'm using the acrylic finishes, though, I'll switch to a finer bristle brush just so I don't get as many air bubbles in the acrylic coating. Now Danish oil is a little bit thicker, and I'm going to apply it with a rag. It's pretty much made out of linseed oil, and it won't change the color of the wood as much as the other ones, but it will sort of bring out the natural wood tones, the sort of oranges and yellows that are already impregnated into the wood grain. They all look pretty good, but I think we're going to go with the gray. So let's get started. So we made our selection. We're going with the gray stain, and Isha here is going to help me. And it's really easy. We're just going to dip into brushes. We're using very small foam brushes, and just paint it on with the grain.
All right. Do you start at any specific point?
Just do your best to keep it even. It dries pretty quick, but it's also not that thick, so you tend not to see brush strokes with this particular product. It's a very forgiving stain. You can keep layering it on if you want to make it a little bit more gray and make it less sort of striped looking.
So do different types of wood take stain differently?
They do, because wood has oil in it, and the different types of oil can resist stains, especially water-based ones. That's why it's good to always do a test sample like we did earlier.
And how long does this take to dry, usually?
On the jar it says 8 hours, but it'll probably be dry to the touch after about 4, but I still wouldn't put anything on it until the full 8 hours.
So does this stain need anything on top of it, or is it okay as is?
Depends on who you ask. I tend not to like to put a protective coating over the top. I like wood to feel like wood. I don't want it to feel like plastic. But then I don't have a house full of kids running around with crayons in their fists. So if you really want to protect it, then go ahead and cover it with plastic. And I would recommend an acrylic finish in that case, because that's the least toxic of the plastic finishes.
How am I doing?
Doing good. I was just debating whether we should go 2 hands and 4 brushes just to go faster, but I think we're making good progress.
I love this color. It's looking great.
Yeah, it's pretty nice. It definitely gives it a more modern look.
Yeah.
Be careful you don't lean against it and get it on your pants. So Isha and I are almost done painting the top of the table. We're going to finish it up, paint the rest, and then let it dry for a couple hours. So the stain is dry and the table looks great. The gray gives it a nice modern finish, and it hides a lot of our beginner level craftsmanship mistakes. Overall, I'm really happy with how it came out. It's super heavy duty, and it's a project you can make in a day that'll pretty much last forever. You can get really creative with this project. You could use it as a desk, you can use it as a dining table, you can make it a little bit shorter, a little bit bigger. But in all, it's always going to be a super heavy duty piece of furniture that you can use for just about anything. Now that you've learned the skills to making this table, have fun making your own. So I guess now it's time to invite some people over and start eating off of it.